righty. It is true. This is my second time back. I mean, the program was so awesome the first time. I was really honored when they asked me to come back. There was another motivation for coming back. In the speaker gift, if you hit the button, it says Beat Navy. I have one of these. I think I'm number 5 or 6. Now I'm reverse engineering and trying to pull the logic off the chip so I could turn that around to beat Army, but I'm afraid of my skills, so I want one more to make sure if I screw it up, I've got one more attempt to get it right. So anyway, no. Today, what's very interesting about operating in these domains, both defensively and offensively, is finding models that we could really gain deep insight from. And what I want to talk to you today about this energy model, this a series of events that occurred in December of 2015, it's a very insightful, important model, lots of lessons learned for us to absorb, both defensively and just from a concept of operation perspective. So I'd like to jump right into that, if you will. Alrighty, so a little bit of background. The role of cyber in conflict, or quite honestly, in a broader sense, in geopolitics, in statecraft. We know it's there. We've seen the development of that from very resourced actors. In fact, so much so that we saw espionage campaigns associated with geopolitical events in the world, trying to gain information on people's positions, what they were going to bring into talks or discussions, where were they realistically, could they back up their assertions, those types of things. We have a variety of threat actors when you think from a nation-state perspective and also from groups, non-nation-state groups. And this is something that's developing. And we're seeing more and more different applications of cyber as it relates to supporting traditional missions. Not only intelligence gathering, but also synchronized into military operations. So with that, I would contend, just in the last 5 years, we've seen a tremendous amount of both economic and geopolitical situations that has allowed for the rapid advancement of cyber tactics, techniques, and procedures into these conflicts. And we're seeing big changes out there, what's actually occurring in the world. Things are going from theoretical discussions to practical applied demonstrations very quickly. Why? Because there's an iterative cycle that's going on. They're learning. These actors are learning, and they're perfecting what they're doing. And we're going to talk specifically about an event that maybe rolls into the, potentially was there because of the Ukraine-Russian conflict. And so we'll switch to energy targeting. I'd like to tell you, I included this slide for the benefit of Lieutenant General Hernandez and General Fogarty, that this is the way we used to do intelligence. Unfortunately, that's actually my stereoscope I got when I was a naval intelligence officer, when I started to do this thing. So that can't be the case. I guess I'm getting a little gray. But if we look at energy targeting from a cyber perspective, Ukraine became a very insightful series of events. What I'm about to talk about today is all drawn from public sources. What's very unique about this model is that a lot of it did come out publicly. In fact, I would argue elements of the Ukrainian infrastructure has embraced web technology, so there was a lot of early information which allowed me to very quickly realize that this is probably more realistic, that the early reports on the event were probably very close to true, and we took a great special interest in this. So I will report on a product that we just released here in the last week or two, working with the NERC, so that the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, in the interest of providing the model of this attack and mitigations for power companies to understand how they should think about the potential of this here in the United States and North America, and how to think about mitigating it and being able to detect and disrupt these type of operations. So everything we'll talk about today is publicly available information. Let's talk about the events. December 23rd, 2015. Much to my family's super excitement, Christmas is coming, and I just got all the chores done, everything's hung up, everything's good, and I'm starting to pay attention to some news, and a Ukrainian news site talks about a cyber-induced power outage. I go, a lot of these things aren't true, and so I dive into it, and sure enough, here comes a research project. Next thing I know, we're getting ready to do everything. My wife's getting very frustrated with me. Why are you always on the computer? What's going on? I'm like, yeah, I think this one's real. And by December 24th, I actually find the Ukrainian utilities talking about their outage. I go, yep, this one's real. And so anyway, what happened at that time is really interesting when you go look at the attacks themselves. These attacks were very well synchronized. They were multimodal. They had multiple stages involved with them, and they conducted against multiple targets at once. Okay? And what was interesting is a lot of people talk about the difficulty of targeting and causing effects in power systems. It's difficult, you need a lot of expertise. And that can be true depending on your concept of operations. And in this case, we saw it done against 3 separate distribution utilities in Ukraine, highly effective, creating conditions and effects the attackers absolutely desired. And it did put about 225,000 people into an outage that lasted several hours. Now, let's put that in perspective, though. The Ukrainian power system is a large power system, and the number of customers that were out of power for several hours is a very small number of total customers in the Ukrainian system. And so that's important to note. So on the scale of big effects for power systems, I would say this was low. Now, if you go out to those distribution utilities, they will not agree with this concept that this was a low event to the Ukrainian power system. They would tell you that this was a very significant event for them in terms of reliability. Now, the Ukrainians were able to restore the system pretty quickly, within several hours. I would contend that, number one, in the context of a conflict, so they kind of understand that. I wouldn't suggest that they were expecting this to occur, but they were able to recover mostly because their system at the distribution level is not that automated, okay? And the automation that did occur, the adversary took advantage of 100%, but a lot of the system wasn't automated, and they were used to manual mode operations. They had a lot of trucks. They were very distributed in their line crews, and they could very quickly go out to the substations, manually flip the breakers back, re-energize the system, unfortunately without the benefit of their SCADA system, because that automation gives you a tool and a capability. So they operated in a constrained state, but they were able to bring the distribution elements back pretty quickly. So it's important to understand that. So let's talk about power systems just a little bit. So in my background, I actually, after I left the Navy and got into this cyber thing, I was involved and became a chief security officer in a major utility in the United States, American Electric Power. And there I was responsible for both physical and cyber security. We had nuclear power plants, thermal plants, that's the generation side of the business. We had one of the largest transmission systems in the United States, a 765 kV system, that's a pretty hefty high voltage system, and then 11 or 12 distribution operations. And so that's what makes up a power system. You have suppliers that generate power. That mixture and portfolio is changing depending on the country you're in. In the United States, we see a lot more renewables on the system, wind turbines in particular here in the US, but natural gas type plants, fire plants, we're retiring a lot of coal plants, and then base station nuclear power plants. In Ukraine, their generation mix actually is some big heavy thermal sites and commercial nuclear power plants. 4 major sites that represent a very lumpy supply system, if you will, making their transmission system actually inherently pretty vulnerable because it's not networked enough, if you will, to move that power around the system out of these large supply sites. So that's your transmission system. That's its job, is to move that power around long distances and distribute it to the load centers. And then finally, the distribution entities are the power systems or wires that transform power down to a consumable level and push them out to your residential or light commercial and light industrial loads. This attack affected 3 Oblenergos, which is the Ukrainian word for an energy company, and the 3 Oblenergos were all distribution operations. So they operated at the 110 kV and below voltage class to move power to customers. So no supply, no generation. They're taking service from a transmission system and pushing that power down to loads being served. Of course, the first order impact of an attack that successfully disrupts a power system is to shut power off to loads being served. So the distribution system is what we usually say is close to the edge, with the loads being the edge. In this case, they targeted completely distribution entities. Now that limits what you can do, by the way. If you're going to target a distribution entity, it's their service territory that immediately becomes the constraint of what you can affect. Unless you can affect it in a way that's dramatic enough that it upflows into the transmission system, causing instability. So that was, before this all happened, and I didn't understand the Ukrainian distribution service territories very well, I started studying that. What is the realm of the possible in terms of what you could hope to achieve by attacking a distribution system? And trying to understand that. Why did they select these 3 targets? Why did the outages occur where they did? Is there significance in terms of the load being served? Is it opportunistic purely that they had actually a foothold on those systems? Was it because those systems had some characteristic that made them better targets than others? I wanted to answer that question. I can't tell you we fully answered that question in understanding this series of events. I've got my theories, but that was important to me. Let me characterize the attacks, because I said they were highly synchronized, they are multi-staged, they're multi-modal, and they're multi-sites that were affected or targeted and successfully attacked, causing power outages. So the attack steps could be broadly broken down to these categories. The tactics, techniques, and procedures were generally applied to each target. They made differences, if you will, based on the target environment itself, which you expect of a highly co-adaptive threat actor, somebody who understands and does some of their homework. It begins with basically an access campaign with infections and a foothold and some early command and control back and forth to understand where they were. Then there's a quick movement, if you will, to harvest credentials, achieve persistence, and what I'll call IT infrastructure control. They wanted to own the environment. We had an earlier speaker talk about cohabitation. I would argue that they absolutely had cohabitation in mind because they wanted to be in there long enough to understand how to develop a concept of operation against these targets. So you don't want to get caught, and you want to get the information you need to help you develop that con-op. So cohabitation. Of course, by the end of this thing, by the way, they're not great tenants. So they're not good tenants by the end of this, and they know that's where they're going to go eventually. Basically, they have to discover they're in the business network most likely, or internet-facing network. They need to discover the SCADA systems and the devices and data necessary to develop a concept to operate against these distribution companies. They do develop that. They have to pre-position themselves, get ready for, because this is, if you will, I'll use a model in my mind, and I'm not talking attribution, but I would say the attack had serious elements of good military precision, execution, and coordination. And so pre-positioning is important to achieve coordination and synchronizing your movements and your activities in those environments. And then finally, you see attack execution on December 23rd, 2015. Will broadly suggest that as the attack is executed, there's a primary attack against or using the SCADA system to achieve their effect. There are also amplifying attacks in order to, if you will, I've described the different elements. Either there was a theory in the IT world, generally speaking, that this was just anti-forensic moves. I was like, no. This was a move to extend the outage period by being able to deny the use of that SCADA system. Once the adversaries use the system, what do? I don't want the defender to use the system. I'm going to destroy the system. So in this case, had destructive elements. Two major ways they had destructive elements. One, they use a module called kill disk. Kill disk was very interesting. So if you go to the IT community, when this was happening and we started blogging about it and talking about it, and the IT community, all the IT big heads came in and said, oh, we know what this happened. This kill disk thing that we pulled out of here, this is a black energy caused the outage. And if anyone knows how electrical systems work, that is unbelievably not true. Someone thought I was really smart because I kept saying that is a wrong conclusion. Like, oh, this guy must be, No, I'm not really smart. Really, honestly, black energy is an infection device. It is part of the access campaign. This kill disk module we were analyzing, what it was capable of doing. It could stop processes. It could overwrite master boot records. And it could overwrite files, specific files. In fact, it was modified because in early October, in Ukraine, there was a use of the kill disk module. It's not associated or developed under the black energy framework of malicious tools. It's something used on the outside. It was used in relationship to Black Energy 3, but it was used against media companies and some other targets. What we found in the distribution utilities was a modified version that had reduced functionality, which is interesting, and some additional functionality. And the IT security community picked up on one or two specific things to include two processes that were kind of weird looking, and they related to SCADA systems, in particular serial to Ethernet converters. And they said, that's what caused the outage. Well, we don't build SCADA DMS systems such that if they go away, the power system fails. Why? They do go away occasionally. When I was at NERC, we had plenty of SCADA systems where they lost visibility, they lost communications, and you don't want to design it that without the technology, power stops flowing. So I knew right away that these are not the reasons why we had an outage. There has to be a much deeper story here relative to how the adversaries developed a concept to operate. Now I want to present you with two models. This model is based off the excellent work they did at Lockheed Martin developing what they call the kill chain, the cyber kill chain, if you know. A lot of cases, the kill chain to me was a great model to think about intrusions and being able to then follow through your intrusions, move throughout the system, get some level of persistence, and then in most cases, control meant espionage, exfiltrating information, okay, which is a great model. When you take it to a cyber physical application like control systems and automation, you have to enhance the model. So we did that. We added a stage 2 aspect to this model to think about how to break down these operations. So we're going to use that model real quick to talk about what they did in Ukraine. So stage 1, steps 1 through 3, is an access campaign. Now this was a very broad access campaign. In fact, all the artifacts we've recovered include spear phishing emails with Microsoft Office documents, PPSs, Excel, Word documents, and the subject line was not targeted or if you will, to a specific type of target set. It was a very broad one coming from the Rada, which is the Ukrainian legislature, talking about mobilization. Well, guess what? Everybody has a brother, sister, son, daughter, friend who could be affected by a mobilization change in policy or order. So lots of people went and clicked on this, and a macro came up saying, hey, do you want to enable macros? Well, of course, I got to read this. Able to enable macros, and that access campaign was launched in the spring or March of 2015. And so that's what it is. Now, to me, very broad-based. They got lots of targets. So the question to me is the adversary in this case has this very blanketed campaign, gets access in lots of places. Now the most difficult decision is which ones do we follow through on? Because we're in lots of places, so very quick effort to discover where are we. And in this case, for the distribution utilities, they are infected. They do bring down black energy 3 droppers. They execute those in various systems within their business network, and they have infections. Some of them are aware they have infections, others are not aware they have infections. So this pushes the adversary deeper into the kill chain, and now it's about pivoting away from these initial infections very quickly. Why? Because you want to go native. These infections have tails on them. You can be seen, although the Ukrainian defense efforts aren't so mature so that they're running Yara rules or doing the kind of things we might be doing to finding infections. And they want to move away from those. Why? Why not? Harvest credentials, become them, go find out, go to your Active Directory services, be able to mess with the authentication and authorizations technologies that they use to manage their own environment, cohabitate. Absolutely objective number 2. So that occurs. We're not sure exactly the time frame in which this cohabitation occurs, but they definitely want to gain, they get away from their C2 architectures, because again, the Ukrainian government's becoming wise after the October campaigns of these C2 architectures, and they want to achieve a freedom of movement and a freedom of action. That's what the adversary wants to do, because they have yet to develop their concept of operating against these specific targets. So, unfortunately, utility IT infrastructure is becoming owned over some period of time. Now, step 5 is, now that I'm here, I do want to develop a concept of operations. Let me see all the type of cyber terrain I can actually get myself onto. And they do this. They go through a process of discovery and a compromise, and they have to move from the business environment into the operational technology environments. Each utility has a different context for this, by the way. Even if you took me to the same operating company, if you will, the same company, and you have different operating utilities in 2 different service territories, but you have the exact same SCADA technology, I will contend there will be differences. There'll be configuration setting differences. There'll even be some cases control theory differences, and there's just different assets. So even though you think you have the same system, you never have the same system. You have a different system. So the adversary has to come up with a concept to operate, in this case, 3 totally different companies. They have to come up with a con-op that works against these differences and overcome that challenge. Now, they're using valid credentials to move around and cohabitate. This all brings us to stage 2 of this attack. So stage 2 is, how do you drive effects? There's lots of interesting ways to drive effects. In a lot of cases, the whole ICS cybersecurity mission for the longest time was, well, the bad guys are going to prevent us from using our systems. And my answer early on always was, that is not the case. That's a very immature bad guy. If I'm a bad guy, what I'm trying to do is actually use your system for you and the features you've designed to enable me to do something. That's the problem with ICS or automation security, not the denial of a computer system or resource, but its manipulation and use for your own objectives. So the second stage is designed to kind of give you that model. The adversary has to do attack development. They have to learn enough about your decisions and choices at an engineering level all the way up to an IT control system operation concept to develop that. They need to tune their attack. They have to validate their attack, typically through some type of testing if they want high confidence process effects. If they're okay with something bad's going to happen, then they don't necessarily need to do that. And then finally, they're going to basically deliver, install, modify, and execute an attack. Now, I also want to break up specific objectives to the adversary: enabling attacks, initiating attacks, and supporting attacks. In a lot of cases, you'll have to do different stages, meaning you'll take one step that will enable you the ability to actually change the process, or to now put a piece of equipment under control of a control system into a state that can be very dangerous, that you can actually cause physical effects, long-term, hard-to-recover effects. So if we look at Ukraine that way, we start thinking about stage 2. And so to develop and test. So now they found their way into the SCADA systems. They're there. They're realizing that each utility probably has even different SCADA vendors. They're realizing they need to develop, how do we cause an outage without having to make too much of an investment, in terms of time, energy, and resources. Maybe that some of these SCADA systems cost millions of dollars, so to be able to procure, if you will, like a farm material acquisition of a SCADA system might not be that easy to do. Setting it up and getting realistic configurations and emulating a power system might not be that easy to do. So can I come up with an attack concept which allows me to make some shortcuts? And these folks do. Very interesting. They come up with a concept. Now, as they're discovering the control system, in a power system, you have two major layers, if you will. You have the control center that's responsible for taking inputs from the field to understand state of the power system, okay? And then you understand either work that you're going to be doing, or dispatching, and what's scheduling in terms of power, and you'll make adjustments to that power system to best meet your reliability needs and serve your customers. That's the control center's job, over supervisory control of what's happening on the system. And you have dispatchers sitting in those control rooms. Then you have the field, which is primarily comprised of substations, or switch yards and relay stations. And in these substations, you have physical electronic devices that have local logic that is supposed to protect equipment in that substation to allow power to flow, and remotely actuated systems that from the control center you could send a command out and you could change state. For example, opening a breaker by de-energizing a line. That's the automation. Those are the two levels. So the attacker has to decide, what's my objectives? And these are objective-driven attacks. That's why I like looking at these, because they aren't just random. So a lot of times the objective is steal lots of money and make money. In this case, they had some very specific objectives. So the ConOp development here that gets developed is interesting, because they realize that, what do I want to achieve? The answer is we want an outage. I do believe there's some time component in the requirement. Somebody said the outage needs to occur for some period of time. And they go about and they develop what I believe was a very effective, not necessarily super sophisticated, but a very effective ConOp to achieve those objectives. They did it by four major areas of their attack envelope. The first is to misoperate the system, use their technology against them. So they wanted to identify all the remotely operated breakers and substations that they can get their hands on. And they were going to open up those breakers for the utilities, maliciously, obviously. Utilities didn't want those breakers open. And in order to do that, at least in one case, we saw the use of what we call a rogue client. The way a SCADA system works is you've got a front-end processor, a communication SCADA server. That's going to push commands out to the field. It's aware of all the tags out in the field, and it gives you that ability to do that. You have an HMI workstation, which we call a dispatcher workstation. The man or the woman in the control center sitting there looking at state and manipulating state. So what they do from a ConOp perspective is they decide, well, here, I've got different technologies to deal with. That's tough. Well, wait a minute. Most of this stuff runs on Windows operating systems. Why don't we stay at the operating system level? In many cases, they go, well, what could we do? Well, what about remote admin tools? Why don't we remote admin into those boxes, lock the dispatcher out so they themselves can't control the mouse anymore? We'll take over the mouse. I call it the phantom mouse. And we'll just operate the HMI as intended. You know what? Not very sophisticated, but extremely effective. The next thing they do for at least one of the utilities, they do get a client application, which would be that HMI workstation, and they actually have what I'll call a rogue client. They actually have a client for that one type of SCADA system. They're able to they must have done some testing, because they load up tags into that, and then they go into their environment remotely from the internet, and they say, hey, don't listen to the rest of these HMIs. Listen to me, and here's what I need you to do. And they send out open breaker commands. By the way, I'm hoping my timer that ran out to zero is, am I at zero? I got a little time? Okay, good. Okay, so we have a bunch of observed attack trends that are important. We have targeting, we have payloads, we have destructive elements to this. We've got tools used, process affected. The ICS components that are attacked are the workstations. I talked about the phantom mouse and the rogue client. That is all at the HMI control center level. I operate your technology for you. We've got IP accessible devices in the substation. They're firmware-based devices. The attacker, after he opens up the system, decides, I'm now going to stop you from using your control system tools to reconstitute your system. So they use malicious firmware uploads. This is where they actually tied the discovered targets. They had to go through an engineering development cycle to develop the firmware uploads, because they're malicious and irreparable in the field, and they did it. They did it effectively across all those utilities, taking out what I call below the bridges. Utility no longer had the ability to communicate for the devices that were taken out. And so that's the other major aspect of it. And then kill disk was used to destroy the dispatcher workstations and SCADA servers by overwriting files. Not very permanent. So if you just map it against the kill chain, here are the different steps. You have an access campaign, which was using Black Energy 3 related malware. You had the credential theft, you had the network host. These are all intrusions to this point. Now I cross the line into the SCADA system. I develop an attack con-op that works. I test it, I validate it. They must have validated the firmware, by the way, because they were almost 100% successful in their malicious uploads. And firmware messing around is sometimes a little touchy. That's why I need another one of those badges so I could do that. Okay, their objectives. Number one objective, and they worked across all three buckets. I was excited. It's another one of our models. Denial of control is the first thing. Make sure the dispatchers themselves couldn't control the system. The second aspect was manipulation of control. I want to operate your system for you. You can't do that anymore. And the third was loss of view and control, because at the end, I'm going to scorch and burn this environment, so you're done. So that's what we saw. So the question is, was it sophisticated? And I wanted to use an Army Air Corps, okay, example, and just enough. Just enough to work, yeah, and it did work. So I would tell you the effects were, and this is another model, is you get down to crossing the line into the control system. I rate it in these four categories. In this case, we had manipulation to disrupt, which they were effective, plus what I'll call anti-restore. So they followed on with attacks that allowed them to make it more difficult to restore, except for manual-only operations. There were lots of mitigations available to the defenders. If you look at every step of the attack con-op and how they had to achieve what they did, lots of ways we could have stopped them. The opportunities to disrupt, these are all the attackers' moves. If we had what I would call CPT engagement, or I actually don't like protection, I like defense. I think if you do a good job with architecture and you do a good job with putting certain planning elements into your defense, if you will, you now have a defensible control system environment. If you use active defense techniques, this is why I kind of rather call them cyber defense teams, you could get in there now, detect and actually disrupt their concept of operation. These are co-adaptive adversaries, so I dismiss the idea that once we get our little checkerboard arranged, that's the game we have to play. I believe we can play chess too, and so that's what we need to think about doing. So this is the report, if you want. These are the websites where you can get the report. Again, it's a public available report. There might be more information available at different levels. I would argue DoD has to be very concerned about this. Our installations is just a collection of control systems that support our major mission areas, and then here's my little codex on the patient warrior. Unfortunately, I think this is very true. I think in the United States, you've seen access campaigns against our power infrastructure, both Black Energy 2 campaigns and Havoc's campaigns. I believe that we have intrusions and we have the successful infections that have already been observed. What I fear is one day, like the Battle of Aleppo, right? We may wake the surprise of the opponent's line draws down with the full benefit of knowing us. And I think this intelligence preparation of the battlefield has gone both ways. In the case of Ukraine, I suspect that's a pretty prepared battlefield. So with that, I just want to thank you and just open it up if we have any time at all for questions.
I don't know a lot about the power grid infrastructure, but ever since they came out with this Ethernet over power type distribution capabilities that you can run in your home, I always had the question of, if that could be scaled, could you use it to influence an EW or a cyber effect across an actual infrastructure and not running across the management infrastructure?
Power systems are power systems will pick up lots of things and modulate them for you, if you will. So you can plug into that 110 volt outlet right over here. I can plug in a frequency monitor and actually monitor frequency for the larger system. I can pick up signatures and modes of any device that's being powered in the system. So it's a level of graduation, how many transformations occur, but there are lots you can do actually using a native power system almost as an unforeseen infrastructure, even from a cyber perspective, if you will. I think that's your point. So yes, interesting things you can do. Sir.
Mike, part of the key to restoring power so quickly was the fact that the crews were distributed and that they had manual override systems. Right. Should we be hasty to get rid of our own manual override systems?
Well, it's in the United States, we're doing it every day. We're doing it smart grid, better reliability. It's true, you get better reliability and more available systems, but we're losing a lot of our manual capabilities. Even on bases during privatization on our installations and facilities, you see the manual capabilities generally still there because it takes money to rip something out, so maybe you leave it there, but you don't operate that way anymore. Honestly, Ukraine probably won't go that direction. They will continue to modernize, and they actually will lose the capability over time. You have to recognize that. It's saved them in being able to restore power very quickly. In the United States, I would contend, somebody say, well, it's apples to orange comparison. I disagree with that statement on a cyber level. I said, no, this is the same type of automation technology. Our distribution utilities, it's not like the Ukrainians were so immature in their technology use that they didn't know what they were doing. Our distribution utilities are very similar. What's different here is we're way more automated and more networked. We actually can't operate with that SCADA DMS system very long. Especially if we're trying to restore a system, that would be a nightmare. The Ukrainians were able to do that. So I would argue that technology is deceptive. You become reliant before you know it. And that's exactly where we've been during most of our system. We're already way past that stage. Maybe down in delivery infrastructures like bases. And by the way, I do have to comment that this is definitely the best lighted stage I've ever been on. Okay. One more question?
So Mike,
Yes.
really enjoyed your presentation. I'm sorry, I'll stand up.
There you are.
Other naval intelligence officer, so
very good.
appreciate the talk. Good representing. So, but in your report, did they find out? So it was only a matter. It was a finite period of time. It was restored within a couple hours. To get to that point, kind of as a military planner, was there an assessment of why they did it? Did one of those power things that they denied power to was actually the target?
Yeah. So that could always be the case. I believe it actually, quite honestly, it was probably involved more with signaling. If you look at the aspects of the attack, you could argue either that there was a very specific time horizon they had to achieve and then all the anti-restoration moves were to achieve that objective. Possible. They could have actually caused a much wider, longer duration outage by attacking the transmission system. They could have done it, maybe that though they had a limited objective, they didn't want to go too far. I suspect the theory says more that it was a demonstration of capability and signaling. Maybe that signaling was supposed to go beyond the borders of Ukraine, if you will. But certainly there's a lot of geopolitical activities going on at the time this attack occurred. So hard to say in terms of the evidence that's available to take a look at this point.
So two things. One, if you could, the slide that had the link on it for the report, if you could just back up, it was flashed up there.
I've been oriented. I know how to do this.
Request.
I think I can back up. Oh, come on. Oh, yeah, look at this. It's slow. It's slow and painful. Okay, I'll get you there. There we go.
Perfect. And then the question I had was kind of, it seems like there are some cyber myths that die very hard.
Yeah.
Related to that, you know, is the attack timeline. Is there any question in your mind that cyber attacks this is a good representation, that cyber attacks take long, and the myth that, you know, that you can attack and that cyber is at the speed of light, and that we don't see it coming, that really needs to just like go away from our thought process?
Yeah, because there's two things that are wrong. When people bucketize everything into malware, then the defense model is terrible. It's just like waiting for, like, give me the signature, and then that's how I do my business. This concept that things are at cyber speed and they're going to come from afar and look very obvious, and so we have to act at cyber speed, I think is also a limited return model for you. This con-op being developed, being tested, being pre-positioned, and then being executed had multiple steps where the adversaries are a bunch of smart human beings that are operating in an environment. And by the way, these utilities are very distributed, so there had to be multiple actors, like working against scripts. Boom, 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 and they're working at the same time. All the power outages lasted within an hour and a half of each other, so they're hitting substations like this, bam, bam, bam. And it wasn't one person doing it. They had to develop themselves. And so I believe you're right. The right model really is, and this falls into the cyber protection team mission concept, is that there are multiple opportunities to detect, multiple opportunities to disrupt, to figure out the objectives of the adversaries, and be able to either within cyber take actions, or even outside of cyber take actions in the physical world in order to accomplish your mission and frustrate the adversary in that environment. And so this is a perfect model for that. In fact, that's why this document breaks all it down, and it also says, look, it's co-adaptive. So this attacker brought the right craft, the right tradecraft, if you will, and skill sets to the table based on the target and what the target was telling them and what they had to do to achieve their objective. They will be different. And so we took the mitigation and said, don't mitigate against the exact attack we saw. Let's talk about the things we do to make sure, because they're co-adaptive, that we can mitigate the next attack, right? So that's an important aspect too. So, awesome. All righty. I think that's it. Thank you so much.
Oh, hold on.
Oh, yeah.
Way to go.
I get mine.
Okay. So there was a lot of discussion at the Army Cyber Institute whether we actually handed off a second coveted, very special ACI black badge, knowing the nefarious things that Michael was attempting to do with it.
Yeah.
But then we stopped and we thought, you might understand firmware on SCADA systems and ICS, but could you really crack the firmware that was coded by members of the Army Cyber
With the
Institute?
anti-tampering mechanisms, I'm sure.
And we felt that this would just be too great of a challenge, so that we are fairly confident that we can present you the second badge, and when
That's
you come
awesome.
back to the next one and see the next Cyber Talks, which is 8 September in New York City, and
Well, you just
you're
get
there in the audience.
My collection.
And you're there in the audience, maybe.
Look, if another world event happens, maybe I'll have a valuable talk and I can get a third.
Wow. But we're confident that when you show up, they will still say,
Beat-
beat Navy.
Yeah, all right.
Way to go.
Fair enough.
Thanks,
Fair enough.
Michael.
All
I
right.
appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Alice.